Let me paint the picture on the importance of oral storytelling, the community it builds, and how Western society has tried to tear it down, and its place in cultures over many generations. This video is best described in three parts. One, laying the groundwork and getting you and me on the same page of understanding. The second, diving a bit more into colonization and language. And the third, two popular books on language and colonization. Como mai, welcome to my channel, Moa Musings. I did post an About Me video in January, so check that out if you'd like to know a little bit more about what I'm doing here on BookTube. I read across genres and focus mainly on Indigenous, Pacific Islander, and Black and Brown authors. Part 1, Beauty and Practices of Oral Storytelling. Whenever I hear something along the lines of the origin of fantasy is England, the romance genre can be traced back to ancient Greece, I always think stories are as old as language and culture itself, all around the world. The origins of storytelling don't lead to Europe. The origins of storytelling lead everywhere. Written language has often been referred to as a key indicator of civilization. A book I'm still reading goes into great detail on the various European ships that roamed the Pacific, specifically Melanesia, and it fed into the European idea of how they viewed civilized and uncivilized societies, often calling Melanesian languages gibberish and societies savage with no regard to learning anything from them. And when ships took the time to observe the people, they did it to figure out how to colonize them easiest. Societies that considered and still consider themselves civilized have used this rationale for centuries to deem other societies that didn't have a written language as uncivilized or savage. Oral storytelling is a practice that has passed on knowledge, myths, legends, teachings for generations. This is carried to this day in what you would call a talk story, and so does the rest of the world. There is a very specific poem I want to highlight that is featured in the book We the Gathered Heat. The poem, Oral Traditions by Travis Kaulula'au Thompson and William Nuutupu Giles, speaks to the history of oral storytelling, its beauty, and the tragedies of multiple diseases from European ships that wiped out thousands, resulting in lost histories and stories. I don't want to give away the full beauty of this poem, but I will share a short excerpt. An ocean erases all that is written in sand, so our ancestors etched everything into the tides of their tongues. In just over 100 years of arrival of the West, nearly 90% of our native population was dead and our language was banned. Only 1 in 10 survived, so a knowledgeable person's death was the same as a library burning down. Societies that were impacted like this have to fight to keep practices alive and pass down as much as they can to the next generation. Much like Pacific Island societies, Aztec and Incas passed down complex histories, historical events, calendar information, and religion through oral transmission. And when I say oral transmission, let's dive into this a little deeper. In my family and culture, oral transmission doesn't mean one and done. When I've talked to people about oral transmission, accuracy is questioned. Since the oral transmission relies on one's memory and ability to relay information. This just shows someone's naivety when it comes to oral transmission. It's stories, ancestral information, etc. that you're told starting at a young age and continually hearing the same stories, ancestral information, etc. throughout your life. Repetition, listening, and observation are key to learning and retaining the information. Also, there are many chants, stories, and myths that are widely told and learned. This is not just one person passing on the stories, but entire generations. So remember, just because you don't understand something doesn't make it less than. Just because someone does something differently than you doesn't mean your way is better. I'm looking at you, audiobook haters. And now that many languages have developed written language as well, oral storytelling is still vital to languages and cultures thriving. We also see the power of oral storytelling through spoken word. When I say spoken word, I'm referring to the catch-all term for poetry recited out aloud. Poetry reading, poetry slam, rap, hip hop, theater, prose reading, the list goes on. Poetry is an art allowing for self expression, creativity, and imagination. Oral storytelling builds community, connecting identities, emotions, and individuals. And you can see that at open mic nights for Poetry Slam. You have an audience that actively engages with what you are saying and snaps what resonates with them. The poet is bearing their wounds, but can heal at the same time with others. And the community and connection it builds increases learning. Speaking of learning, a lot of studies have shown early oral storytelling to a child and encouraging them to do oral storytelling themselves increases fluency, comprehension, and overall child development. Oral storytelling in a home increases the passing on of family stories, otherwise not told. Story formats allow for lessons and values learned from a young age. It shows how people overcome certain problems and grow. Storytelling coaches kids through hard situations. It gives them a case study and examples on how to deal with different problems or challenges, some that the child may not be willing to talk about. Storytelling from a young age also builds confidence and self-expression. One study said storytelling at a young age has, quote, psychological and educational benefits such as enhanced imagination to help visualize spoken words, improved vocabulary, and more refined communication skills. And this study goes on to show more brain activity in young children during storytelling, which is more performed rather than just picture book reading. Through various studies, the hierarchy of child brain activity has video viewing like on the bottom, then picture book reading, and then oral storytelling. But raising kids is hard. Do what you need to do. I'm not saying anything on parenting. I just found the deep dive on oral storytelling very interesting. It's really interesting for me to see as a Kanakamo'oli whose culture and language was banned for a time and how much it has impacted generations of people. To see Western studies on the practice of oral storytelling and its benefits is so telling. Like, yes, of course, it helps with brain development. All these years later, Western societies still like to prove what Indigenous communities have known since time immemorial. I'm thankful to all the generations for keeping the practices and stories alive. So let's dig a little deeper into colonization and Indigenous languages. Part 2. Language is the heartbeat of culture. This history is important because it's recognizing the flaws of the US, its colonization tactics, and the incredible amount of work and resistance Indigenous communities had to do in order to keep languages alive. According to various textbooks in the National Geographic, they've estimated anywhere from 7,000 to 10,000 languages globally. And one goes extinct, it's estimated every 2 weeks. 96% of languages is spoken by 4% of the global population. A language is considered vulnerable when children speak the language of their parents only at home or in the company of relatives. A language is considered endangered when children no longer study it, although it is their mother tongue. Also, a language is considered critically endangered when the youngest person who can speak it are grandparents. There are hundreds of extinct languages, and this means language is no longer spoken or studied. And a language is alive when a speaker can speak to at least one other person in said language. Between 1950 and 2010, 230 languages went extinct. Today, 1/3 of the world's languages have less than 1,000 speakers. Keep in mind, the number of 1,000 speakers should be looked at relatively. Let's think about this a bit more. Think about it in smaller communities, like 500 speakers on an island in the Pacific is quite a lot. An estimated 50 to 90% of dying languages are expected to disappear by the next century. The United States has 10 documented extinct languages. All but one are indigenous. Languages go extinct for many reasons. From what I know and have read, it comes down to capitalism and colonization. An Atlantic article said, quote, "This is a cultural tragedy driven by economic globalization, technological change, and government policy." Full transparency, this is an oversimplification. A lot of languages considered endangered, at least in the Americas, are indigenous languages. But simply documenting the language just for it to die is not enough. Empowering the communities that hold these languages should be the goal. Thriving communities will keep the languages alive. The current practice to document languages is getting dangerous. I just want to make an important note. Sometimes I'm in conversations with people, and the view is that the issues that cause language extinction are in the past, but they are very much current. In 2022, a news story broke showing the exploitative practices in place to do said language documentation. I'll share a quote from the article. Quote, "The Lakota Language Consortium had promised to preserve the tribe's native language and had spent years gathering recordings of elders, including Taken Alive's grandmother, to create a new standardized Lakota dictionary and textbooks. But when the tribe asked for copies of the work, one member, Ray Taken Alive, noticed that everything was copyrighted. The traditional knowledge gathered from the tribe was now being sold back in the form of textbooks." End quote. Taken Alive, who teaches Lakota to elementary school students, told the tribal council in April of 2022, quote, "No matter how it was collected, where it was collected, when it was collected, our language belongs to us. Our stories belong to us. Our songs belong to us." On May 3rd, the tribal council voted unanimously to banish the Lakota Language Consortium, along with its co-founder, a white dude, and its head linguist, from ever setting foot on the reservation again. Maya, the co-founder, worked with a number of other tribes who also had concerns about his work. The nonprofit that Maya established, the Lakota Language Consortium, was established in the early 2000s and have received more than $3.5 million in federal grants over the past 15 years for language revitalization projects with tribes across the country. Quote, "But several indigenous academics, legal experts, and tribal leaders say the consortium is asserting control over more than the teaching materials it makes. It's the community-specific information and tribal history that's contained within the books. Some of the words and phrases in the consortium's materials have never been recorded or transcribed before, and charging a marginalized community any fee for them is unethical." End quote. The article goes on to say, Native American communities often share things communally. This includes land, resources, and knowledge. And that really runs in conflict with U.S. copyright law. U.S. copyright law really allows companies and nonprofit organizations to commoditize their work and product, including pieces of shared language. This reminds me of another story that broke in 2018 when the company Aloha Poke, started in Chicago, Illinois by a white dude, trademarked the phrase Aloha Poke, and then sent cease and desist letters to various businesses, including some owned by Kanakamoli, Native Hawaiian. There are countless examples of indigenous languages not receiving the same respect as other societally dominant languages. Going back to the idea of land, resources, and knowledge being held communally, there has always been a movement for sovereignty in most indigenous communities. This includes governance, land, laws, and most recently, data sovereignty. A recent podcast episode of All My Relations did a deep dive into what indigenous data sovereignty means and could look like. As we know, the corporations trade in data now, and this poses a huge danger to everyone, individuals and entire communities. A lot needs to be ensured and further done to protect existing databases and ensure data sovereignty moving forward. Indigenous communities holding the sovereignty of their data prevents it being stripped, lost, or in some cases sold back to them. Now I'm going to dive a little into the revitalization of Olelo, Hawaii. The Kingdom of Hawaii was illegally overthrown in 1893 by the United States of America. 3 years later, the Hawaiian language was outlawed in schools, with children harshly punished and teachers losing their jobs if they disobeyed this law. In addition, parents could not converse with their children in public in Olelo, Hawaii. Prior to the overthrow, literacy rates for Hawaiians among the Kingdom of Hawaii citizens was estimated at 91 to 95%. They had an established education system by 1840, including medium schools and a high school. Because of the overthrow and the language banning in 1896, by 1985, only 32 children spoke Olelo, Hawaii. It's often recognized that it takes one generation to lose a language and 3 generations to recover it. 2 proverbs that hit similar sentiments, Ikaolelo no keola, Ikaolelo no kamake, and Aia ke ola I kavaha, Aia kamake I kavaha. They both essentially translate to language is life. Going to a talk by Nainoa Thompson, a master navigator, when the Hokulea, the voyaging canoe, was visiting California. He talked about the language revitalization efforts, starting because Kanakama Oli went to Aotearoa, New Zealand, to learn from their language immersion programs and bring it back to Hawaii. Quote, a handful of children in the first Hawaiian immersion classes in the 1980s has grown to more than 2,500 students annually enrolled in the 11 preschools and 21 immersion and charter school sites. Another 8,000 study Hawaiian language in other higher education settings each year. There were many early challenges in the Hawaiian immersion program. They had to find locations and teachers, they developed curriculum, and create materials that didn't exist. Each family with children in immersion preschool or school was deeply involved in that school and perpetuating the language at home as well. A commitment that continues among immersion families today. With every passing year, another class was added, new teachers were hired, curriculum and materials were developed, and in 1999, the first classes graduated from high school. Part 3. Colonization impacting language in books. Lastly, when I started thinking about fiction books that tackle language and colonization, the first 2 that came to mind were Babel Babel and Blood Over Brighthaven. Babel or Babel, however you want to say it, is about the magic of language and translation. The story follows Robin Swift, orphaned by cholera and brought to London by the mysterious Professor Lavelle. There he trains for years in Latin, Greek, and Chinese to one day attend Oxford's Royal Institute of Translation, also known as Babel. One quote shows how translations are an act of betrayal. Translation means doing violence upon the original, means warping and distorting it for foreign unintended eyes. So then where does that leave us? How can we conclude, except by acknowledging that an act of translation is then necessarily always an act of betrayal? The more you learn another language, the more you realize a translation is a choice on the meaning of the word made by the translator. Often you can see the translation of the word people translated to man in a patriarchal society. So when linguists simply want to document a language, I ask, to what end? To simply translate its knowledge and tales so they are warped and stripped? In book Blood Over Brighthaven, the reader follows Sayona, who becomes the first female high mage in a very sexist society. But wait, the society is also racist. Quen, who are forced to work low-paying jobs and serve as the story's indigenous population. Tomel, called a nomadic hunter, like, we got it. The realest moment for me was in the book when Tomel is talking about teaching his niece their language, even though they're the last to know it. Unsure of his choice, but he knew he wanted to keep the culture alive and the language with it for the next generation, and to hear his language because it reminded him of the rest of his family. There are countless examples of fiction fantasy books, including featuring the ruling power controlling information people receive, stripping language and culture through erasure tactics. So, if there are any you'd like to recommend, please put it in the comments. I love reading for the simple fact that books provide me with lessons and seeing the world through a different perspective. Please like, subscribe, etc. if you'd like to see more of this. The entire video idea came from the fact that I'm tired of audiobook isn't reading discourse, and I wanted to turn it on its head and show its true colors of colonization, not even touching on the other issues that arise from that conversation. Thanks for watching, and see you on the next video.